New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara was absolutely phenomenal up against the Atlanta Falcons, but it wasn't enough to overcome another game riddled with self-inflicted wounds. We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media, covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're breaking down the New Orleans Saints 26-24 loss here in Atlanta, an absolute heartbreaker for this New Orleans Saints team that should have won this game. We're going to dive into the injuries that are now coloring everything about what this team's potential might be this season. We're going to take a look as well at why the New Orleans Saints just can't seem to get things right when they face adversity. And we're going to kick everything off with a look at Alvin Kamara, who played his absolute heart out, but unfortunately wasn't able to do enough on his own, not on his own, but wasn't able to do enough to overcome the self-inflicted wounds that end up telling the story of this game. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara was absolutely spectacular in this game, but unfortunately, the New Orleans Saints beat themselves, and the Atlanta Falcons didn't have to do it for them. Look, Alvin Kamara is where I want to start this off because I think that he is the biggest story going into this game. Dealing with rib injury, dealing with a hip injury, all the things that he was dealing with coming into this game, and playing his absolute heart out on 26 different touches in this game. His fourth straight game, every game so far this season, he's been over 100 scrimmage yards. Let's not lose sight of the fact that this is the same guy that at the beginning of the season, everyone was saying that the team may not be able to retain, or that, you know, he didn't deserve a contract extension. He's looking for a contract extension, all those other things. And he has put all of that aside and played his heart out so far this season. And look, I think he's going to be on the injury report a bunch again going into this week as the Saints get ready for their Monday night game up against the Kansas City Chiefs. The good news for New Orleans is that they have an extra day for this one. But man, Alvin Kamara, and really, along with Chris Olave, played his heart out today. And it's frustrating, I imagine, as a player to play through injury, to drive and push, motivate, dedicate, all this other stuff, and then to come up in a game like this, which New Orleans Saints should have won. If you really look at it, the Saints scored every touchdown in this game, or at least were responsible for every touchdown in this game. The issue is that they scored too many points in favor of Atlanta. The interception that bounced off of Matthew Judon's hand on the attempted screen abort. You saw the muffed punt on just a complete misfield by Rashid Shaheed, a play and a punt that he shouldn't have been trying to fair catch within the 5 anyway. Ends up going off his shoulder, leads to the first score of the game. Somebody says it, and I think it was, former New Orleans Saints head coach Jim Mora said it too. Shoulda, coulda, woulda is what a lot of this game was. The New Orleans Saints nearly outscored themselves, giving up 14 points to, not really, but giving up 14 points to the Atlanta Falcons, and then just putting them in a position to where they were not able to make up for what it was that they had gifted Atlanta in this game, in a game that by all intents and purposes they should have won. Taysom Hill ends up exiting the game, but not before scoring 2 touchdowns. Derek Carr played a pretty solid game outside of the fluke of a pick 6 that took place, but that pick 6 becomes more important than the 77% completion, the 230 plus passing yards, all those things. The pick 6 ends up being more important because you gifted the other team 7 points, a team that otherwise on the offensive side only scored 12 points in this game on 4 field goals, including, of course, the game winner. Then you look over to the defensive side, more self-inflicted wounds with a 30-yard pass interference penalty. The Saints defense just not able to be clutch in this moment for a second week in a row. where you get the offense down the field, they score a touchdown, they take the lead with about a minute left in the game, and then really the defense held Atlanta to just 5 yards, but the 30-yard pass interference penalty for a guy like Younghoe Koo, giving him a 58-yard field goal, that's a chip shot. That's the NFL's new Justin Tucker right there. And so that ended up kind of changing everything about this game and the complexion of this game. And it's an unfortunate situation to where you have a really great performance by Alvin Kamara spoiled. You have what I think was, and what I would call, the best wide receiver one performance that we've seen from Chris Olave spoiled, right? Chris Olave, again, for the second week in a row, converting third and manageable after third and manageable after third and long after third and long, getting to the spots where Derek Carr knows he needs to be. The trust between those two has grown so much that Derek Carr told us after the game that after a certain point when, like he was getting pass rush and all this stuff, he just kind of aired one out to a spot that he knew Chris Olave was supposed to be in, and they end up connecting on those situations. Chris Olave almost caught a touchdown over on the right sideline as well as Derek Carr bailed out of the pocket, but ends up getting pushed out of bounds. And he did all of this while also managing a hamstring injury that you could tell was bothering him all throughout the game. But much like Alvin Kamara, just gutted it out and put up a good performance. But unfortunately, it all gets overshadowed by the Saints and their miscues and their consistent self-inflicted wounds and kind of handing this game in a way to the Atlanta Falcons. And it's really unfortunate. It's upsetting to see because this team came in ready to kind of manage the adversity that was ahead of them. They kind of played well on the offensive line, despite the fact that they were going with Shane Lemieux as a first-time NFL center or starter at center after losing Eric McCoy in last week's game. They also had a backup right guard in Landon Young, who I thought played well. You had this great performances by Alvin Kamara and Chris Olave. You had a fairly solid performance from Derek Carr. You got a great performance from Rashid Shaheed in the receiving game, but the thing that's going to be talked about when it comes to those last two guys are the interception and the pick six that goes the other way, and then the muff punt that turns into a touchdown for the Atlanta Falcons. And that's going to color everything when it comes to this game, despite the actual good performances that they gave on the offensive side of the football. But that ended up being the difference in this game. And look, Dennis Allen came out after the game, was not happy with the performance, was not happy with the loss, which, like, good, right? You shouldn't be. And so I appreciated his sort of candor in that situation. But one of the things that he said was that they have a really good football team in that locker room. And if that's true, the New Orleans Saints need to prove it, because good football teams don't have all these self-inflicted wounds. Good football teams don't shoot themselves in the foot. Good football teams don't lose to themselves. And that's what happened in this game. The New Orleans Saints did not lose to the Atlanta Falcons, who otherwise only put up 12 points unassisted. The New Orleans Saints lost to the New Orleans Saints in this matchup, and that cannot continue to be the case, especially next week up against a much, much better team in the Kansas City Chiefs. So that, for me, is kind of the bottom line in this game. Heroic performance by Alvin Kamara, fantastic performance by Chris Olave, solid performances all around the offense, but none of it enough to be able to overcome not being able to be clutch at the end of the game, self-inflicted wounds, gifting points, all those other things. Those are the things that tell the story of what the New Orleans Saints experienced and lost to in this matchup. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints are very much struggling when things don't go perfectly. Why is that? We'll break it down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Game Time is the best place to go, whether you're buying tickets months in advance or if you're like me and you're buying tickets last minute, minutes in advance. I absolutely love utilizing Game Time for that reason. Having, traveling and all this stuff, being out of town, being able to just pick up the phone, take a look, open up the Game Time app, figure out what's going on in the city that I'm in, and then buy quick tickets to go and do that at a more affordable rate sometimes than if I bought them months in advance, because oftentimes on Game Time, the tickets actually get cheaper the closer that you get to the event. There's just nothing better than Game Time and their outstanding ticket buying experience. You can toggle on all-in pricing, so you're not taken by surprise by any fees by the time that it's all done. You also see views from the seats before you buy your tickets. It's absolutely outstanding. So take all the guesswork out of buying tickets by going over to Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, Create an account and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. All right, family, continuing on with this episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much for being here. Another rough loss for the New Orleans Saints, who started off the season absolutely on fire. 44 points in the opening week, 47 points to follow that up, or maybe it was vice versa, but still 91 points over the course of the first two games. And then you have a 12-point output up against the Philadelphia Eagles, and then a pretty solid output here. 24 points typically in a game to where you don't gift the other team 14 points. Like if the Saints didn't have that punt fumble for a touchdown, if the Saints didn't have that, or it really didn't have one of those two things, right? The punt that led to a touchdown or the pick six, the Saints win this football game by scoring 24 points. No questions asked. Like they did a very good job for the most part. The issue is that when the New Orleans Saints face some adversity and things don't go perfectly, they struggle quite a bit. Why is that? Well, I think that part of it is that when the Saints are kind of one of those, like, when it rains, it pours type teams. It's never that a play doesn't go the way that you expect it to, and it leads to an unfortunate 3rd and long, or it leads to a 10-yard loss or something like that. It seems that with the New Orleans Saints, when something goes wrong, it's nearly catastrophic. You go back to the Philadelphia Eagles game and all the things that went wrong in that game for New Orleans. Couldn't get their offense off the field, or off the ground. In some cases, couldn't get the defense off the field. You have an injury on your offensive line, and it turns into a 6 to 8 week absence for your starting center, all those other things. Then you end up coming to this game, and every mistake is a big pivotal mistake, right? There were very few little things that went wrong for New Orleans. There was a lot of big stuff that went wrong for the New Orleans Saints in this game, and sometimes that can be very, very hard to overcome as a football team. When your big mistake to start off the game hands 7 points to the opposing team, when your big mistake after 2 straight scoring drives gives the Atlanta Falcons another 7 points, when your big mistake at the end of a game puts the Falcons in field goal range, that stuff is really, really hard to overcome. And so it feels like when the Saints have something go wrong, it's something massive that goes wrong for them. You have a miscue at the end of a game where receivers, where defensive players collide with one another, and it leads to a 61-yard catch and run from the opposing tight end when it comes to the Philadelphia Eagles, or somebody doesn't fill a gap appropriately and it turns into a 65-yard touchdown run by Saquon Barkley. Those seem to be the issues that the New Orleans Saints continuously seem to run into as they struggle in these games. And so these moments of adversity have led to some big-time struggles for the New Orleans Saints. And it goes beyond what happens on the field, right? It's the injuries. It's Taysom Hill getting knocked out of a game, coming off of a bruised lung, now has an abdomen injury on the opposite side. I believe it was a rib injury on the opposite side. You lose Demario Davis, you walk into the game, and just a few snaps in, you lose Willie Gay Jr., who stepped up in his role, so on and so forth. It's challenging to overcome these types of things when they're layered so deep, or they have such a big impact or ripple effect, however it is that you want to define it. Those are the things that end up happening to the New Orleans Saints. And it's surprising sometimes too, getting on a slightly different topic, but still in the means of adversity, right? Facing adversity and struggling to power through it, is that the Saints now for 2 weeks in a row have been one possession away from winning a football game, right? Have taken the lead late, around a minute left in a game on both games. Against the Philadelphia Eagles, they did that, getting up to that 12th point when they scored a touchdown to Chris Olave over on the right side, and then they end up giving up, a big, or they end up giving up another touchdown drive right after that. Then you get to this game where they get the touchdown from Alvin Kamara to go up 24-23, and then they can't close the game out with a minute left in the game. Not because the defense didn't play well, but because you have that Paulson Adebo pass interference penalty that equates to 30 yards gained, which were pretty much the only 30 yards that they gained on that drive. And it leads to a field goal to win the game. It's little things like this late in games that have caused the New Orleans Saints some issues. So not only is it like little mistakes and, self-inflicted wounds and things like that, but like there's an execution issue for New Orleans, particularly late in the games over on the defensive side, which is not what you expect from the New Orleans Saints when it comes to this being a Dennis Allen defense. And when it comes to this being an excellent defense, otherwise, it feels like the last minute or last 2.5 minutes is where the New Orleans Saints defense kind of curbs a little bit. And that's not going to win you football games. In fact, it's going to lose you a lot of football games. So that's something the New Orleans Saints really kind of have to figure out. Dennis Allen and his defense are going to have to stand tall at the ends of games when your offense goes down there and does what it needs to do, which is march and score and take a lead. You have to be able to preserve, you have to be able to protect that lead. And so it's challenging, right? Like, Dennis Allen talked about, I mentioned this a second ago, but to go back to it, Dennis Allen talked about them having a good team in that locker room. I don't disagree from an individual talent standpoint. This is still a very talented team, but it feels like we're having conversations that are super similar to last year, to where they have all this talent, but they haven't been able to take advantage of it. I thought Clint Kubiak called a fine game. There were a couple of play calls, particularly the pitch on 3rd and short. We saw it work the first 2 weeks of the season. He's continued to go back to it. It's not working. Go to something else. Find some other wrinkle or counterpunch that goes with that. But outside of the majority of it, it felt like execution was kind of the bigger issue again in this one. So until the Saints are able to win games that don't go perfectly, this is going to be a team that struggles. This is going to be another down the road, middle of the road team until they're able to do that. But until they're able to do that, they're going to struggle to win games, and they're going to struggle to win games against good opponents. They're going to struggle against, they're going to struggle in games against opponents that they make better, which is kind of what we saw here. It felt like the Saints made the Atlanta Falcons better than they actually were in this matchup. And it's not going to work. It's not going to work for them. So they've got to get these things figured out. And one thing that I haven't mentioned over on the defensive side yet is kind of the lack of pressure. It feels like every year the New Orleans Saints come to Atlanta. Atlanta's dealing with injuries on the offensive line, and the Saints aren't able to get pressure on the opposing quarterback. Credit to Peyton Turner for getting the sack on Kirk Cousins that almost turned into a big-time turnover for Atlanta, but Nathan Shepard not able to recover it. If I remember correctly, I think he was the one that was closest. You also got one where the coverage was really good downfield, and so Kirk Cousins rolled out, and then Chase Young was able to kind of put some pressure on him to make him throw the football away. But outside of that, not as much pressure as you were preparing to see or expecting to see from this New Orleans Saints defensive front. So another example of things just not going perfectly for New Orleans and the team not being able to take advantage of or not being able to navigate the fact that things weren't going perfectly. And that's what good teams do. Good teams don't have and suffer from self-inflicted wounds. Good teams don't have and suffer from what they gift to other teams. Good teams take care of business. And the New Orleans Saints were in position to take care of business here again and weren't able to get it done. So they've got to get that figured out as they move ahead. Coming up next, I want to take a look at the injuries for the New Orleans Saints. And then I want to get back to the positive a little bit and kind of celebrate some of the other things that did go well if you're looking for encouragement around this team. Let's get to that as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, who had the New Orleans Saints as 3-point underdogs going into this game. The New Orleans Saints lose, but they did cover the spread. So if you got that 3-point spread, you're feeling at least pretty good, a little bit better than maybe most Saints fans feel after this performance and after this game. But, FanDuel is a great place to go to kind of make the most out of everything going on around the world of sports, but particularly for NFL fans, it's a great way to start off with a big return with our friends over at FanDuel, which is America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game and you want to check something out, FanDuel is not only a place where you can go for live betting, but it's also a place where you can go to grab the latest stats, live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets. It's a true all-in-one experience. And right now, new customers are going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's for new customers who place their first $5 bet. You get $200 guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints dealing with more and more injuries in this game. I feel bad because, like, there's so much about this game that could have gone really well for New Orleans that just didn't. And one of those things is injury related. So I feel like I'm kind of like beating a dead horse here as I try to break this game down for you. And I feel like I'm beating you up. It's not my intent. It's just that, like, this is unfortunately like the way that this game panned out. And it's not going to get easier for New Orleans. They've got Kansas City coming up on Monday Night Football, who will be without Isaiah Pacheco, it sounds like, who might be without Rashee Rice as well, the big wide receiver. But for the Saints, going into this game, they were already down their starting center in Eric McCoy, their starting right guard in Cesar Ruiz, and their starting linebacker in Demario Davis, who inarguably is the most important player on their defense, maybe on their team from a leadership perspective. Demario was here today, still gave the halftime speech before the game, so you could see him still very much being a part of, my goodness, being a part of everything in terms of, getting this team ready. Sorry, I said my goodness because as I'm doing the show, they're literally driving bleachers behind me from one side of the field to the other side of the field. So I apologize. It kind of took me by surprise a little bit. But for New Orleans, it only added more injuries when it came to this team today. Taysom Hill going out. He was already dealing with that bruised lung injury that kept him out week 3, now dealing with an abdomen injury that ended up really changing the course of this game. The New Orleans Saints felt like they were really cooking early on in the game. And like, I'll do like players of the game here in a second, but best believe Taysom Hill's one of those guys because you saw the impact of what he could do when he was on the field and the impact of what it meant when he was no longer on the field. You can kind of see all of that. New Orleans also ended up in this game having to deal with an injury to starting linebacker Willie Gay, or starting in this game. With Demario Davis out, Pete Werner moved over to the starting, or the kind of Mike linebacker spot, kind of running the communication, green dot, helmet, all that other stuff. Meanwhile, Willie Gay Jr. moved into Pete Werner's previous role, which was a role of kind of coverage and all those other things. But then a hand injury ended up knocking him out of the game as well. So he ended up not being able to go out. I thought DeMarco Jackson fit in extremely well and did a good job in his place. The Saints also lost Tyrann Mathieu partway through this game, late in the third quarter, came off the field and then wasn't able to get back out on the field. He told reporters after the game that he was dealing with a calf injury. We saw that he's been on the injury report for a while with a heel injury, and then he also ended up leaving this game with a groin injury. And so things just piled up for New Orleans. And it's tough to win games when you lose both of your key communicators. Now, I think Will Harris does a really good job of communicating. I thought Pete Werner did a really good job of communicating in this game as well. But it's going to be tough when you lose Demario Davis and Tyrann Mathieu. Like, that's just going to be hard to overcome. And the Saints defense certainly did struggle to overcome the loss of those two key players over on that side of the football. So big injuries to watch going into this game. I expect that Chris Olave will be back on the injury report this week. I expect that Alvin Kamara will be back on the injury report this week. Those two guys, again, gutting it out in this matchup. But, they'll probably take it easy on them over the course of this week of practices. The Saints could get a little bit of a boost back in next week's game, depending upon where Kendre Miller is. The expectation is that Kendre Miller, New Orleans Saints second-year running back, will return to practices this week. Is he going to be cleared to play? Like, is he going to be conditioned well enough to go out there and be able to play right away? We don't know. We'll see. But they could get a little bit of a reinforcement when it comes to that. So those are your injury updates for New Orleans. And then we'll see if there's anything else that comes up here over the course of the week as well. But just a tough matchup for New Orleans and a lot of tough adversity that they kind of had to fight through in this one. I'd still like to do players of the game, kind of game balls in this, because I do think that there are players that are deserving of that recognition. We mentioned Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara, again, over 100 yards from scrimmage, 77 rushing yards and a touchdown in this one, along with an additional 42 receiving yards. I just thought he was absolutely phenomenal. Chris Olave catching 8 of his 10 targets in this one, 87 yards, his third straight game over 80 yards. And I mentioned earlier, although I didn't elaborate as much as I probably should have, that this game felt like Chris Olave's first real, like, wide receiver, not first real one, but this felt like the most wide receiver one game that we've seen from Chris Olave thus far. And part of the reason why is that when the Saints needed first downs on third downs over the course of the past 2 games, Derek Carr has just looked for Chris Olave, and it's worked out several times. The Saints in this game ended up being 7 of 13, so converting over 50% of their third downs. And I haven't counted it up, but I know for sure that Chris Olave was responsible for the majority of those third down conversions. He was responsible for 3 third down conversions last week as well. I just thought that he played a fantastic game. So I would say he deserves a game ball, a player of the game kind of recognition in this one as well. On the defensive side, really the guys that stand out, I thought that Pete Werner played really well, stepping in place of Demario Davis. Shane Lemieux on the offensive side, deserves a little bit of recognition as well. But I thought Pete Werner stepped up and performed well there. And then the last thing that I thought that they did really well too was Marshawn Lattimore. I thought Marshawn played really well in this one. Had a great pass breakup on Kyle Pitts at one point, who the Saints did not let run rampant the way that some maybe thought that he might. He was targeted, I believe it was just twice. He was targeted 3 times in this game. 0 catches allowed, or 0 catches for Pitts in this one. So I thought that he played, Marshawn Lattimore, a really, really strong game. Alante Taylor had to come out, got checked for a concussion, went back in. He had 2 passes defensed in this one as well. Tackle for a loss for Chase Young, tackle for a loss for Peyton Turner. Solid stuff from some of the New Orleans Saints defense. It was just the not showing up in the clutch part when the offense goes down there and gets the lead late. It stinks, man, because it's like the Saints defense, for all intents and purposes, played really well, but all that's going to remember it is that they gave up the final drive, the 30-yard pass interference that led to the field goal that won the game for them. Derek Carr played a solid game in this one, but all that's going to be remembered is the fact that he threw a pass that got tipped up by Matthew Judon on some really good reflexes, intercepted by Troy Anderson and brought back for a pick 6. And even Rashid Shaheed had actually a fairly decent game. He was good in the kick return area, but he had that punt that he really shouldn't have tried to field, if you ask me. And Dennis Allen also mentioned that that's one that they shouldn't have tried to field. But then he turns around and he gets 83 receiving yards, including a long of 25 in this one, catching 8 of his 11 targets. But all he's going to be remembered by is the very first mistake of the game for the New Orleans Saints. And look, that's NFL football, right? Like, we always talk about this. NFL games are decided by 3 or 4 moments. You want 3 or 4 moments? Fumble or mishandled snap, mishandled punt, pick 6, pass interference penalty. Those are the 3 plays. Those are the 3 moments that tell the entire story of this team for the New Orleans Saints. And that stinks because otherwise there was some good play by this New Orleans Saints team. But again, it's a story of self-inflicted wounds. It's a story about the New Orleans Saints. The Saints scoring points on their side, doing what they needed to do. Saints playing good defense, but then the Saints also gifting 14 points to the opposing team. It's tough to win games like that. All right. I'm done beating you over the head with what went wrong for the New Orleans Saints. I fly back home tomorrow morning. Once I get home, I'll get another episode up for Monday, kind of doing a little bit of a deeper dive into this one. Keep an eye out over at LouisianaSports.net. I'll have my evening column out later on, as well as a film study little piece in the morning as well. So we'll have some good stuff for you. It stinks that this game ended the way that it did, because this could have gone a very different way. And the New Orleans Saints are 2 defensive possessions away from being a 4-0 team. And right now they're a 2-2 team marching into what feels like a 3rd loss on the way in terms of the way that everyone will predict the game in Kansas City. So we'll see if the New Orleans Saints can shock the world and how the New Orleans Saints rebound from this one. We'll continue to keep you up to date with it all throughout the week. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen. For your second listen, go and check out Locked On NFL as well. 2 episodes a day, giving you all the biggest stories from around the National Football League. Tyler Rowland and Tony Wiggins giving you everything you need over there. And, of course, we'll be back with you here for another episode tomorrow. Thank you very much, despite the loss, for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.